Hello everyone. This video is about the causes of the American Revolution, and there are a number of steps that were in place before the revolution actually began at Lexington and Concord, and we're going to talk about some of the political causes of that. So we could go back in time, as far back as the earliest settling to discuss the causes of the Revolutionary War, but for the purposes of direct causes, we go back to 1754. The French and Indian War begins. It lasts until 1763. And in other parts of the world, it's called the 7 Years' War. And I am bad at math, but even I know that is 9 years, from 1754 to 1763. But it was called the 7 Years' War elsewhere because of the different continents it was waged, both in Europe and what would become the United States. But in the U.S., we call it the French and Indian War. The French teamed up with Native Americans in an attempt to drive the British out of the Ohio River Valley, which at the time was the Wild, Wild West. And so, the old powers of Europe were battling for dominance in the New World. And the Native Americans teamed up with the French, not because the French were super nice to them, but because they recognized that the French were nicer. They didn't kill the Native Americans as much as the British did. Yeah. So the French and Indian War was a win for the British, but there were lots of challenges that came along with that. Incidentally, a young colonel, a 19-year-old George Washington, colonel in the British Army, had several very daring raids during the French and Indian War. But after the war was over, wars are expensive, and in order to raise funds for after a war is over, then you've got to have money come from somewhere. And so the British government decided, we'll tax the people. And that's something that is pretty typical after war is over. So the British decided to tax the people in Great Britain, in the UK, but also their colonists across the ocean in what would become the United States. At that time, they were still 13 colonies, not 13 states. And so the Stamp Act goes into effect in 1765 for this purpose. And the design of the Stamp Act was to raise funds to help replenish the treasury following the French and Indian War. But the colonists took it as a strong offense, and that's because the Stamp Act required an official stamp, a seal, from the king that would be executed by a king's agent before you could buy anything with paper. And so it was a stamp on paper. So no newspapers could be purchased without paying for this stamp. No writing materials, so you could not write letters without also affixing an extra stamp. And the price of the stamp was very often prohibitive. And so the settlers objected to this very strongly because it meant that they were limited in their knowledge by the crown. They could not find out what was going on in the world because many of them couldn't afford a newspaper anymore, and they could not connect with one another. The only way that people stayed in contact back then was through writing letters. And so if you lived 20 miles away from your parents, the odds were good that you saw them once a year at most. And now 20 miles is nothing, but back then it was an insurmountable distance. And so if you were unable to communicate via letter, you were cut off from your family and the outside world. And so the colonists objected to that one quite strongly. And so Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act, but they replaced it almost immediately in 1767 with a group of taxes collectively called the Townshend Acts. And they were named after Charles Townshend. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. But the Townshend Acts were a series of taxes. They were more imposing than the Stamp Act had been, and covered a broader range of materials. And this was done because the British Crown objected to the colonists' objection. So the king was the kind of person who thought, I'm the king, God told me I get to be the king, and you have to do what I say. And so the idea that the public would disapprove publicly, would disapprove socially, and in large groups object to what he was doing was something that bothered the king immensely. And so Parliament was full of lords. The House of Lords was the one that had power at that time. And so there was a lot of, how dare you, rebel, rebel. And so the Townshend Acts were designed to be a bit of a punishment for the colonists. And so they included several other items. One in particular that became a cultural kind of statement. The colonists objected again to the Townshend Acts, and this time they became more and more proactive in their objections, and they started having more public displays of frustration. And we're in the late 1760s, early 1770s now, so you can see that we're coming into the early days of what will become the American Revolution. Only about 30% of the colonists at this time were interested in a full revolution, and that's because a revolution's a big deal. Almost all revolutions result in being squashed, and so the colonists recognized the danger that was inherent in revolution. But the Townshend Acts themselves eventually mostly were repealed, and there were still some elements that were frustrating for the colonists. Under the Townshend Act, for example, soldiers were quartered in private homes to make sure that the taxes were being upheld and collected, and that people were behaving as they were required to do so. And that was a hardship for a lot of colonists, because the colonists had to pay for the British soldiers' upkeep in their private homes. They had to pay for so many ounces of meat, so many ounces of beer per day, and a lot of those colonists were poor and they couldn't afford that for themselves, much less for an unwelcome soldier. And they were frustrated because it was peacetime. You shouldn't have a soldier checking out everything that you're doing during a time of peace if you're not at war with your country. And so the Townshend Acts, many of them were repealed, and in 1773 a tea tax was the only one that was left. And that's where we really see the turning point towards revolution from the colonists. And the tea tax itself was a tax of 3 cents per pound of tea. Tea could only be imported from England. You could not get tea anywhere else in the world. You could not create your own. And so this caused a real cultural challenge to the public. And that's because tea was the only beverage that was acceptable for everybody. So back in the day, you had to boil water before you could drink it. And that's because you don't want to die of diarrhea, which is what's going to happen if you drink water straight out of a well. But if you boil water, it tastes really flat. It tastes bad. And so people would add tea leaves to the water and make it taste nice. It was one of the few things that everybody could agree on. You could also have beer. That was the only other real option that was safe, but beer's not safe for everyone, right? Little kids don't need to be drinking beer. Old people, pregnant ladies, okay? So tea was really the beverage, the only beverage of choice. It was the only option that there was for almost everyone. And so this idea was like a slap in the face, that you'd have to pay extra for something that was really seen as a necessity. And so in 1774, the Boston Tea Party occurred. Many of you are familiar with that. Some colonists dressed up as laborers and boarded a ship that was bringing in a shipment of tea from England and tossed all the tea into the harbor. Oh, the poor fish. Can you imagine all that caffeine? They were like, swimming in circles. I haven't slept in 3 fish days. So fish aside, this was not going to break the Bank of England or anything like that, but it was definitely a political response to something that was seen as a cultural offense. Incidentally, that is also the time that we became a nation of coffee drinkers, because that is something that people could brew on their own. So if you are a coffee addict, now you know why. If you like tea, hot tea, that's definitely still an option now, but we, by and large, really prefer our caffeine in coffee style in the morning. And so this led to the spreading of information from one colonist to another, that there's really this rankling situation going on. There was a lot of frustration, and so delegates were sent from each of the 13 colonies and were put forward, were designed to create what was called the Continental Congress. Later, there was a second Continental Congress, and so this one then became known as the First Continental Congress. But at the time, it was just called the Continental Congress. We didn't know there'd be a second one. And the Continental Congress will be discussed on another slide.